If that bill is successful, no one could talk about Alabama history because there is no way to talk about the history of Alabama without talking about the many ways in which race conflates that history.
We have on the line Derryn Moten. He is a professor at Alabama State University, a professor in history. Really excited to talk to him. Professor Moten, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate your time. And I just wanted to start, if you could kind of introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do at Alabama State, but also what you do in the labor movement, because I know you've been a long time labor movement leader here in Alabama. So if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. As you know, a steel mill town, just like Birmingham, Alabama. And so I was familiar with the labor movement because my brother worked for U.S. Steel. My dad worked for, he worked part of his professional career for Chrysler, the other part of his professional career for Ford. So he was a member of UAW. I am a graduate of HBCU, Howard University in Washington, D.C. After that, I received graduate degrees at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. and the University of Iowa in Iowa City. My doctorate degree is in American Studies. I have taught at Alabama State University since 1996. I currently chair the Department of History and Political Science at Alabama State University. I am a member of the Higher Education Policy and Planning Council for the American Federation of Teachers. It's we advise the elected officers and the Executive Council on higher education issues. There are other policy and planning councils for such as the nurses or nursing profession, as well as K-12. I am also a Southern Regional Vice President for the Alabama AFL-CIO.
Yeah, so you wear a lot of hats, obviously.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that I'm also a co-president of the Faculty Staff Alliance at Alabama State University. We received our charter in 1994. We are the only higher education affiliate for the American Federation of Teachers in Alabama. As you probably know, AFT is now affiliated with AAUP, and so I'm happy for that joint affiliation because back in the 1960s, AAUP came to the defense of one of our faculty members who was summarily dismissed by the governor, Governor John Patterson, for, I believe, his friendship with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. King, wow, as well as a biography that he wrote about Dr. King. The title of that biography is Crusader Without Violence. It's the first biography written of Dr. King, and it was literally written on our campus. And it was one of two, or it is one of two biographies that was written while Dr. King was alive.
Wow, that's really cool and definitely appropriate for the weekend to bring that up as well. I did not know that. And that's a really fascinating kind of connection in terms of how that organizing started. And I wanted to ask you a little bit if you could share some of your thoughts about maybe what's unique or what's different about organizing at the HBCU environment. Because I imagine There are some unique aspects to being at a HBCU compared to like a regular university, so to speak. And then there are, of course, some of the same struggles that workers face everywhere, particularly at the university level. So could you talk a little bit about that experience of the HBCU organizing?
Yeah, I think a lot of people believe that historically Black colleges and universities are sort of off base, or should I say that it's very difficult to organize on these campuses, and it's really not. It is difficult, but it's difficult to organize any campus.
Right.
But the first higher education affiliate for the AFT is Howard University, and that was back in the 1940s. And so unions have been successful in organizing some of the more well-known historically Black colleges and universities, such as Howard University, such as Wilberforce, such as Delaware State. And so there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 101 HBCUs. The vast majority of them are not organized. A number of them are private. So that presents another challenge.
Right.
But I think organizations, or I should say unions like the AFT, I think we have taken a different sort of tack in terms of whether or not we can be successful in organizing HBCUs. Certainly, I think there's an interest on these campuses to be represented. And so I think we're going to see more efforts in the future to organize these campuses. But as I said, the history of organizing Black colleges goes back to the turn of the 20th century.
Right, right. And I think, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention there. I worked for the Alabama Education Association for several years, and in that capacity, I got to know quite a few workers at Alabama A&M University, your big rival here in Huntsville, and they were experiencing a lot of issues and had very little representation or recourse, and it really spoke to me about the need for higher ed organizing, and so I think that there's a big potential with AFT. So if anyone from AFT National is listening, I definitely think Alabama is ripe for organizing, both at the higher ed level and at the K-12 level, because frankly, there's a lot of educators whose voices are not being heard, and protections that are not in place that really should be. And the other thing that struck me is that when I talked with some of these workers, obviously they came from various backgrounds. Racially, there was white workers, there were immigrant workers from Asia, from Africa, and then there were Black workers from Alabama. And in that group in particular seemed to it seemed to sting more. It seemed to be more personal and really hurt when their university did them wrong. Because I imagine that most of the people who work at HBCUs do so because they have a story similar to yours, right? They went to an HBCU. It gave them and their family opportunities that they maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. They have a deep love for the institution. And so that is always a difficult thing when you have this love and this cultural affiliation with an institution that is also your employer and may be mistreating you, you and your siblings. So those are just a couple of the things that came to mind about that. And I think it's very impressive that you've been able to lead up the AFT's efforts here in the state at the higher ed level at Alabama State. And really appreciate that. I did want to ask you, because of your background and because of your experience as a history professor, the Alabama legislature is talking about, yet again, banning what they call critical race theory. And in this case, now they're calling it divisive concepts, right?
Right.
So
right.
I'm curious, as a history professor, as someone who, is also a worker, right? What are some of your thoughts about this push from Alabama Republicans to interfere in the classroom?
Well, I think for the proponents of that bill, the divisive issues bill, they're advocating. Well, if that bill is successful, it would suggest that no one could talk about Alabama history. Because if one is sincere about the history of Alabama, there is no way to talk about the history of Alabama without talking about the many ways in which race conflates that history. So, I believe I understand the impulses of, as I said, those proponents of CRT, who, or I should say, opponents of CRT. It's hard to talk about the enslavement of or enslavement. It's hard to talk about what happened to immigrants in the 19th and early 20th century. It's difficult to talk about what happened to indigenous people in our country, the forced migration of native or nations to the West. These are difficult subjects, but I think these are difficult subjects that we have to tackle or we have to broach. As I said, I think I understand the impulse of why people don't want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about it because they don't want to be reminded of this history.
Right.
You can't walk. You can't walk in anywhere, or I should say, there are very few places that one could walk in downtown Montgomery and not be reminded of this history. So what are we going to do? Are we going to remove all the statues? Are we going to remove all the monuments? We would even have to remove the first White House of the Confederacy. I think at least my duty as an educator and my duty as a historian is to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to the best of my ability. And I'm not saying there's one truth, but we have to have these conversations. And to be quite honest, one of the reasons why I wanted to live in the South and teach in the South is because of the way in which these topics resonate in the South differently than they resonate in other parts of the country, particularly in northern Indiana, where I grew up. So the idea that people would still have or would still question the efficacy of the Confederate States of America or the government of the Confederate States of America. The fact that, we would still question whether or not the Confederate battle flags represent slavery. Of course they do. I found it amusing, but not really surprising, that presidential candidate and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley had a difficult time, except, or I should say, admitting that that the Civil War had anything to do with slavery. Of course it did. You know, all one has to do is to read Alexander Stevens' so-called cornerstone speech, the speech he gave in Savannah, Georgia, where he talked about the cornerstone of the new Confederate government was enslavement. And so it was clear that enslavement was the main reason for the Civil War, I should say, or the main reason for the Southern states that succeeded from the Union fought in the Civil War.
Right.
And because, you know, enslavement was the bread and butter of the Confederate economy. All one has to, my favorite antebellum cities, or two of my favorite antebellum cities, are Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. And if one visits those two cities, and if any of your listeners have not visited those two cities, I would strongly urge them to. Because, you know, when you go to, or when you visit Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia, I don't have to remind you about the wealth that slavery produced. You can see it with your own eyes.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's clear. People were able to live like kings and queens off of the free labor of Blacks in this country. And so those people who do not want to talk about these topics because they find them divisive, of course they are divisive, but they're also accurate.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Yeah, I mean, you can't hide truth. I mean, I guess you can try, but, you know, the facts are what they are, and you know, this is reality, and reality sometimes is divisive, and reality can be, you know, difficult to process, but this is what happened, and you know, and it's very insulting, I think, to everyone involved, frankly, the idea that we can't have authentic conversations about the realities of our history, because that's how we learn. I mean, that's how we move forward. Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that you know, you mentioning that about Nikki Haley, it was shocking to me too. Or, well, I mean, that people would still try to peddle, you know, some of this lost cause kind of stuff. The idea that the Civil War was not about slavery, or perhaps you know, on the periphery it was about slavery, but it was about these bigger questions of, you know, states' rights and how you know, deep the government is going to be entrenched in our lives. You know, this is, if we teach the history, people will understand that this was a myth that was purposely embedded in Southern schools by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and this
the
is
Sons of Confederate Veterans,
the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the Daughters of the Confederacy. This is not the organic understanding that arose immediately after the Civil War was over. That it happened. This understanding that became popular among white Southerners happened after redemption, after the fall of Reconstruction, when white supremacy reasserted itself in the Southern United States. And like you said, there's just nothing that race and racism and Jim Crowism does not affect when you're talking about, I mean, really in the entire United States. You know, I think that some folks in the North kind of see themselves as outside of America's racial history, but that, I mean, that's clearly not the case. But particularly in the South, I was talking about, you know, the why is it, somebody asked me, that unions have not been able to take as much a hold in the South as they have in the North and the West. And it is explicitly because of racism. If you take a look at if you read about organizing campaigns in Alabama, for instance, where campaigns tried to ignore the color line and organize interracially, they were brutally repressed and destroyed by the state. And then where they tried to respect the color line, respect quote unquote, and organize black folks and white folks separately, then obviously this division was bad for workers, and the black workers would scab on the white workers and the white workers would scab on the black workers, and then all to the benefit of the boss, right? I mean, it's all race permeates everything. And, you know, folks have to understand that.
Yeah.
Right. You know, a lot of people don't know that when the approximately 90 boycott leaders were indicted in 1956, Dr. King was the only one that stood trial and was convicted. He was convicted of a 1920 anti-boycott law. A lot of people believe that law was written specifically for an event or an action like the Montgomery bus boycott. It was actually an anti-union law that Dr. King was convicted of. And so this is the reason why Attorney Fred Gray did not want people to refer to the Montgomery boycott as a boycott. He wanted people to refer to the Montgomery boycott as a protest because he knew if they advocated a boycott that they would be in violation of this 1920 law. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to, well, I shouldn't say it's hard, but we have to unpack all this history. And, you know, the point you made about the North is absolutely correct. The Constitution of the United States was a pro-slavery document.
Right.
The 3/5 clause, the fugitive clause. I mean, those were pro-slavery measures. This whole idea that the Northern delegates in the Constitutional Convention did not want to send any signals that they were opposed or that they would do anything to oppose enslavement in the South. And so, you know, the compromise was a compromise. You know, just like we know that Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation affected those states in rebellion against the Union, where there was a problem with Lincoln signing a proclamation, which was equivalent to an executive order, freeing those states in rebellion against the Union. He was not the president of those states in rebellion against the Union. So, yeah, there are all kinds of ways in which people were vexed and conflicted on this topic of enslavement. Right.
Well, and, you know, I think that some on the right have whipped themselves into such a frenzy about this, you know, this idea that people would teach history, and the fact that you know, race is a pretty central kind of theme in American history. They've whipped themselves into such a frenzy that they are now even moving backwards from where the right began or where the right had kind of landed post Reagan. You know, Reagan was the one that signed MLK Day, and they are and there are some elements that are no longer on the fringe that have really radicalized themselves into being against the Civil Rights Act. You know, I mean, you may not be you may not be familiar with this college right-wing organization, Turning Points USA, but it's a fairly prominent kind of organization on the right that tasks itself with organizing right-wing students on college campuses, and its leader kind of de facto is Charlie Kirk, and he has on Monday coming up supposedly this big expose exposing the real Martin Luther King, and he's going to talk about how Martin Luther King was this radical anti-American communist activist, and all that's bad, and we actually shouldn't have signed the Civil Rights Act. I mean, this he is a mainstream conservative figure openly saying we should not have signed the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah. And so, I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this, but, this whole thing about race and racism, and it is, one cannot deny, or one can't deny, but the truth is the truth. The whole idea of race was created to marginalize and to exploit certain people. And so in our country, this notion of race, the idea of the 1/8 rule that Louisiana had, anybody that possessed 1/8 Negro blood was classified as a Negro. Well, we know in the Plessy decision that, or I should say, we know that the Plessy decision challenged that because Homer Plessy did not look like a Negro. Most people did not recognize him as a Negro. And even the Supreme Court itself, in its majority opinion, wrote that Homer Plessy's, quote, Negro-ness was not discernible in him. In other words, end quote. In other words, one could look at Homer Plessy and not know he was a Negro. So, again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but we know that race is fictive. White folks ain't white because they're white. Black folks aren't black because they're black. But we know that there are meanings that are posited into these words, black and white, that are historic, that are unique in some regard to our very country. And the fact that the last state in the United States to remove an anti-miscegenation law from its constitution was our state, Alabama, and we did so in 2000. Well,
and so you say that, I actually remember my parents got married in '88, and they had a black woman in their ceremony. My parents are both white, I think, obviously, but they had a black woman in their ceremony, and that was like a controversy. And after their marriage, the church actually changed its rules around who the church would marry to exclude people that were not as a part of the church, quote unquote. Like my mom grew up at that church, but she was no longer part of that church. And so they changed the rules after my parents got married. And my parents are not, they're not like radical, progressive activists. They're just like, they were just kind of normal people. And my mom had a black friend, right? And so she was in her wedding, and that was apparently very controversial. Right. So, well,
anyway, Dr. Moten, I know you got to run. I wanted to just give you the final opportunity to speak on kind of what you see ahead with 2024 and the Alabama labor movement. If you have any sort of final thoughts on the task ahead and what you see coming. Well,
I'm a witness to what the positive impact of being a member of a union can have on workers. As I said, my dad was a union member. Most of the adults that I knew growing up were union members because they worked in the steel mills or they worked for one of the auto plants. It is not hyperbole to say that the unions built the middle class. And, I cringe when I hear people brag about how good our economy is. Well, I can take you to plenty of places, and these places where the economy is not so good. My hometown, Gary, Indiana, is one of those places. It wasn't that place when I grew up there, but it is that place now.
Right.
And it's largely because of the disappearance of labor jobs, of union jobs.
Right.
They went south. They went south of the border. They went to places like Korea. And so I think, you know, the fight for the middle class is the fight for union membership, union wages, and I just think that we have to continue to hold industries, or I should say the magnets of these industries. We have to hold their feet to the fire. You know, when Booker T. Washington was the president of Tuskegee Institute before it became Tuskegee University, he had some of the wealthiest industrialists on his board of trustees. People like Andrew Carnegie, people like Julius Rosenwald, people like Alfred Baldwin. And, you know, they shared their wealth. Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools, Andrew Carnegie and the construction of free public libraries across the country. We don't see that as much with this new industrial class or I should say this, the extremely wealthy that we, business people that we have in our country today. And so I think, you know, again, it's important to remind people that the history that we're experiencing now has not always been our history.
That's right.
And, you know, and so, you know, people deserve, they deserve equal opportunities. You know, what's happening in terms of public education, or I should say higher education, where students now are graduating, you know, some as many with student debt that amounts to six figures. That's a terrible burden to place on a young college graduate. And so, you know, I think we have to be more sensitive to such, you know, to the circumstances that we are placing the next generation in. And I think unions have a role to play in that. And I certainly think unions will take up that challenge.
Professor Moten, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.